Thank you all for joining us for today's exclusive broadcast on the GRC 2020 Innovator Award and the Source Intelligence Network. This is Devin Simonson. I'm from Source Intelligence and I will be moderating today. Before we get started, we have some general housekeeping to go over. All the PowerPoints that you see today and the video of this webinar will be available shortly after we conclude at sourceintelligence.com/webinar library. Additionally, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them into the GoToWebinar control panel. We will send out a follow-up email with all the responses after the webinar. First, we will hear from Michael Rasmussen. Michael Rasmussen is an internationally recognized pundit on governance, risk management, and compliance, with specific expertise on the topics of enterprise GRC, GRC technology, corporate compliance, and policy management. With over 22 years of experience, Michael helps organizations improve GRC processes, design and implement GRC architecture, and select technologies that are effective, efficient, and agile. He is a sought-after keynote speaker, author, and advisor, and is noted as the father of GRC, being the first to define and model the GRC market in February 2002 while at Forrester. Next, we have Keith McCann. Keith has 25 years of experience assisting electronics manufacturers with new product introduction, product regulatory compliance, and manufacturing automation. In his role at Source Intelligence, Keith works with Fortune 1000 organizations to implement robust and efficient programs for compliance with the Dodd-Frank 1502 conflict minerals rule and the European Union REACH and RoHS directives.
All right, Michael, let's go ahead and start off with our first question here. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about GRC and the research that you do?
Well, Devin, it's certainly a pleasure to be here today. Well, my job is an analyst. Some people often refer to me as a consultant, but I don't like that label because it sort of doesn't really differentiate me from what the consultants actually are doing out there. I really do research. And I research what organizations are doing, what their big issues and drivers and trends are in relationship to governance, risk management, and compliance. And I research the different solutions out there, technology solutions, content and intelligence solutions, as well as professional services firms. So organizations often engage me on not only what solutions best fit their needs, but what professional services firms like consultants to work with. And so I like to differentiate myself from consultants as I'm a market research analyst. I spent 7 years at Forrester and now 8 on my own. But GRC is essentially what I research and do: governance, risk management, and compliance. GRC is something every organization does, whether they use the term or they use another term, ERM, or maybe they don't even have a name for it. But all of organizations have some approach to governance, risk management, and compliance, from the ad hoc to the agile and mature. And they are facing a range of different risk and compliance issues and governance issues that impact their business. Some approach it very issue specific, some department level specific, and some on an enterprise basis. But GRC, at the end of the day, the official definition is that GRC is a capability that enables an organization to reliably achieve the objectives, the governance piece, while addressing uncertainty, which is risk management, and acting with integrity, that's compliance. When it comes to different GRC processes and practices, there's many different types of approaches that organizations have. Some, have structured technology and information architectures, but what I find is that a lot of organizations are trying to manage processes like the topic today, third-party or supplier management in documents, spreadsheets, and emails. And this is just a recipe for disaster. It reminds me of Hercules and the Hydra. Hercules had many different battles to fight, one of them being this multi-headed dragon, the Hydra, and you chop off one head and multiple heads will grow up in its place. And that's the way a lot of organizations approach aspects of GRC. Something comes up like conflict minerals from the Dodd-Frank Act, and all of a sudden there's a spreadsheet out there that everybody's using, and they're sending that off for their surveys and assessments, and when all of a sudden they're getting back hundreds, thousands of different spreadsheets that they've got to compile into report, and it takes time, a massive amount of time. I had one organization tell me that 80% of their resources was nothing more than document reconcilers trying to reconcile and build reports out of literally thousands of different documents, spreadsheets, and emails. And they lack what we call non-repudiation. There's no audit trail. How do you know that, like in this case, supplier answered that question on that date and time And some of you, whether the organization or the supplier themselves, didn't change the answer to paint a rosier picture and get themselves out of the trouble. The regulators are cracking down on this. I've seen this several times now lately, in which the regulators are saying, approaches in document spreadsheets and emails that lack any integrity and lack an audit trail just are not going to work. It's not good enough. And that's the hydra of inefficiency that we see in a lot of areas of GRC, including areas of third-party and supplier management. The heart of GRC is at what I call the GRC Capability Model. This is from OSEG, the Open Compliance and Ethics Group, and I'm an OSEG fellow and have contributed to this significantly over the years. But GRC, as I mentioned, is something every organization does. It's the reliable achievement of objectives while addressing uncertainty and acting with integrity. And every organization does GRC, whether they have the label GRC or not. They have some approach to governance, risk management, and compliance. At the end of the day, I see GRC practices and processes very much like a Six Sigma or the Japanese Kaizen methodology. It's about improvement, and where can we improve? The newly released GRC Capability Model version 3, I think, really shows this well, in which we've got iterative cycles of improvement. And you can see the graphic here on the screen, in which we have the learn, align, perform, and review, and there's circular motion there, meaning that there's constant change that the business is under. We've got to manage that change, and we've got to be able to improve our GRC processes in a continuous evolving area. So the first element is learn. And learn, we understand the external context and the internal context, the culture of the organization, the stakeholders. This is very relevant to today's topic of third-party management and supply chain management. External context could be your geopolitical risks and regulations and things that bear down upon the organization in context of third-party management. Internal context is who are the internal stakeholders that engage third parties, as well as who are the third-party relationships themselves and down the tiers of the supply chain. The culture is the values and ethics of the organization, and the overall culture of compliance and risk-taking apply in there as well. I've had the benefit of sitting on a major Fortune brand Social Accountability Advisory Board to help them with dealing with their processes and a technology approach for managing 5,000 vendors, or suppliers, I should say, with over 20,000 facilities among the suppliers and their global supply chain around human rights and international labor standards, dealing with child labor, forced labor, working hours, wage and hour. That all becomes part of the culture, the values and ethics of the organization itself, which is critical in this area that we need to understand because it's going to impact how we manage our suppliers. And then you have the stakeholders. The align really is, what are the different groups out there that are involved? Now we could talk again about this for broad enterprise GRC, but particularly in the context of third-party supplier type management, who are the different stakeholders that need to be involved on the team for supply chain risk management? Areas like procurement, legal, corporate compliance and ethics, IT security, different elements there. Quality, environmental health and safety, and so forth. What are the objectives? How do we identify the risks and assess the risks? And how do we design our program? That's the align. The perform is the ongoing day-to-day operations of GRC broadly, or specifically supply chain risk management. What controls are in place? What policies, like a supply chain code of conduct and other related policies? And how are those policies written? For example, one supply chain code of conduct I reviewed was a horrible mess. It was written in the passive voice, not the active voice, with long, complex paragraphs and going off to thousands of suppliers and an international audience. And the first paragraph said, company believes, and the second paragraph says, company strongly believes. So we have different levels of belief in the supply chain code of conduct. That doesn't make sense. And it'd be backwards how we usually write a policy, where the most critical things are first, followed by the subsequent items. But it was filled with a passive voice and things too, and very hard and difficult to read English even for an English speaker. And here we are communicating this to an international audience that predominantly has English as a second language. So how do we communicate our policies like code of conduct? Are they written correctly? The communication of those policies, education and training programs, different incentives as well as notifications like hotline and issue management, inquiry being like self-assessments and surveys we send out like conflict mineral surveys, and the overall response when we have issues and incidents. Then the review element looks at the ongoing monitoring of our third-party management program or broader GRC program, the role of audit and assurance when we exercise our right to audit clauses and do on-site inspections, and how do we improve our programs over time. That's the GRC Capability Model. And again, I try to go through it in the application of third-party and supply chain risk management specifically, but it's what we also use very broadly for enterprise GRC across different domains. But as an analyst, what I cover is the GRC market. And we have a market for technology, GRC technology. There's over 700 solution providers that I've mapped into the GRC technology market. Some do what we call enterprise GRC platforms. There's about 130 that do different aspects of third-party management, which includes our host today, Source Intelligence. But even there in the third-party management, there's a variety of companies that do different things. Some focus on IT security, some focus on conflict minerals, some focus on being a broad platform, and so forth. Then we also have the GRC intelligence market, or what you would call the content market. I've mapped 112 different content providers with over 384 content or intelligence solutions. In the context of third-party management, this includes things like politically exposed person lists, watch lists, sanction lists, geopolitical risks and alerts, reputational risk type offerings, and regulatory change, risk libraries. There's a variety there. And of course, we have GRC professional services firms, which is a huge market in and of itself. When you start going beyond the big four to all the mid-tier, but even local, regional consulting firms and law firms and things, there's a lot of providers. At the end of the day, to finalize your question there, Devin, but the GRC 2020's research enables organizations to be more aware of the changing regulatory and risk environment that's there and how to address that, more aware of what's going on internally to the business. And how do we collaborate and share information within the business and across third-party relationships? As part of my research, therefore, not only do you want to be aware, but being aware means we can also become aligned. Where can we share resources? Where can we learn from each other, particularly within the organization, and collaborate? When we can become more aware and aligned, we then become more responsive. We can quickly identify issues and know that my view of risk in isolation might not seem big, but when I understand other people's risk and exposure, we understand that across departments that could be a significant risk, and we can respond more quickly and contain issues before they grow to be big issues. All this should enable us to be agile. We're in a market that, a business environment that is constantly changing. Laws, regulations, enforcement actions, risks, business change. These are significant things upon the business. We need agility in the context of things like regulatory change and things that's bearing down upon us. So then we can be more resilient as well as lean and efficient with our use of resources.
Thanks for that, Michael. Our next question that we have here is, what are the challenges and trends you're seeing in third-party supply chain risk management?
Certainly. Third-party management is the fastest growing area of the GRC market. Now, in third-party management, you could put in the ERP and procurement players in there, and that's not growing as fast. But the risk and compliance side of third-party management is growing at about 35% annually, compound annual growth, the market for this, because organizations are under so much pressure. If you think about organizations today, we don't live in a day and age where the term insider just defines employees. You go back 20 or 30 years ago, the term insider pretty much was a synonym for employee. Not today. Over half the employees, over half the insiders of an organization are contractors, consultants, temporary workers, outsourcers, service providers, contractors, you name it, intermediaries, agents, brokers, vendors, and suppliers. All this bears down upon the organization. How do we manage this? We live in a day and age where one of the largest credit card breaches in history, being the Target breach, the doorway into that was an HVAC vendor, a heating and air conditioning vendor whose systems were compromised, and they had a legitimate connection to the Target network, this heating and air conditioning vendor, and hackers broke into the heating and air conditioning vendor and then therefore gained access to the Target network, compromising point-of-sale systems and literally hundreds of thousands of credit card numbers. That's the complexity of the environment we're in, the complexity of third-party relationships. To borrow a quote from the poet John Donne, you have no, instead of an individual, no person, you have no organization is an island entire of itself. Every organization is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. We are an interconnected mesh of relationships, and this is challenging a lot of organizations, and there's a lot of regulatory requirements that are coming out of that. The most recent one being what's coming this month in October, with the United Kingdom's Modern Slavery Act, and the compliance requirements, go full in effect right now in October 2015. Lots of challenges, lots of legislation, lots of regulations impacting organizations. In the context of all the pressures upon organizations, some of the things that I'm covering that are part of third-party management include things like anti-bribery and corruption, supply chain, vendor code of conduct and ethics, dealing with conflict minerals, corporate social responsibility, environmental compliance across the supply chain, dealing with geopolitical risks and supply chain disruptions, health and safety, import-export compliance and dealing with sanctions, information security, labor standards or social accountability, things like child labor, forced labor, working hours, wage and hour, health and safety in the context of labor, operational risks, privacy, quality, just general regulatory compliance, physical security, and the range of all these together being supply chain risks. At the end of the day, it's about integrity. Integrity is living up to who you really are. And organizations, have policies, they have a code of conduct and values. There's statements from the board about how great an organization it is. And at the end of the day, integrity matters in who you do business with. Because their issues are your issues. Their integrity problems are your integrity problems. And we need to understand who we do business with, because it really defines who our organization is at the end of the day. So the challenge I see before organizations in this area of third-party supply chain management is that we have to ask the question, can you attest to the governance, risk management, and compliance of the organization's extended business relationships? Whether it's brokers, dealers, agents, intermediaries, contractors, consultants, temporary workers, outsourcers, service providers, vendors, suppliers, can you attest to the risk compliance across those extended business relationships and even downstream? The typical response I find is that organizations tend to look at the formation of a third-party relationship on the onboarding side and fail to foresee the issues that cascade and cause significant damage to reputation and exposure to legal and regulatory risks and operational risks throughout the ongoing relationship. That might have been the right relationship 2 years ago, but something's changed in the environment. Are we aware of it? Do we know? And that's what a lot of organizations are struggling with. So at the end of the day, organizations with third-party relationships, supply chain relationships, they're like this guy here on the screen on the right, riding a bicycle, standing on top of it while juggling. There's so much going on. We have growing risk and regulatory concerns around us in third-party relationships, whether it's enforcement actions for things like FCPA and other anti-bribery and corruption, to new legislation like the Modern Slavery Act I mentioned in the United Kingdom, to OCC requirements in banks and so forth. Lots of growing regulatory and risk issues. The reputation and brand of the organization's on the line, but we often have to manage this without adding more staff time and resources. And so we have inadequate resources. And then we have to deal with supplier confidentiality. How do we get information from our suppliers and be able to protect their confidentiality for the information they give us? But a lot of times they want to be able to attest to things but not expose themselves and give out what they feel is sensitive information. How do we manage downstream requests and data and going down the supply chain and subcontracting relationships as well? And there's the interconnected third-party risks that are not often connected. How do we understand things? Take bribery and corruption, for example. So maybe you have a business strategy and it's to grow operations overseas and in a certain country, and you're building facilities and you've got different agents working for you in those countries. And all of a sudden you go to get your permits to build your facilities, and the agent's there talking to the government official. And the government official says, well, in order for you to build your facilities, I need this contribution. Right there, somebody is making a risk decision and a legal decision for the company. Do we continue with our strategy and hit our goals, or, and in that context, pay a bribe, or do we refuse the bribe and risk not meeting the goals? Now, from an ethical point of view, I think you know where I'd stand. But at the end of the day, we need to be able to show the interconnectedness of all the risks in our environment and be able to monitor this. We also deal with silos of third-party oversight. You might have one group dealing with social accountability, and another group dealing with health and safety, another group dealing with conflict minerals. And they're going to the suppliers, and everyone's sending out different assessments and things in different formats and approaches. And it's a burden on the organization, but it's also a burden on the suppliers. How can we streamline things and make it more efficient to them? This is particularly inefficient when we're using documents, spreadsheets, and emails. Because it becomes an excessive amount of time for building reports. At the end of the day, as we consolidate things, those reports are often riddled with errors, and they lack an audit trail of who did what, when, how, and why. So we have all these scattered and non-integrated approaches. We often approach third parties and suppliers on the onboarding process and don't think about risk and compliance after that. And in that context, the business is constantly changing. Our business, the regulatory and risk environment's changing, but our third-party business environments are all changing as well. And how do we keep all that change in sync and make sure that we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's consistently, time and time again, as change happens? We have the issues of third-party performance evaluations that neglect risk and compliance, and oftentimes looking at the first tier of relationship and not really understanding the risk and exposure down the tiers of our supplier network. And at the end of the day, being able to provide accurate data related to areas like raw materials and things. Lots of challenges and trends that I'm seeing out there in the environment that organizations are struggling with.
Great stuff, Michael. I'm glad to hear all this information. Let's go ahead and move on to the next question here. In regards to our third parties and our suppliers, what do you see helping suppliers in a third-party supply chain risk management like platform?
So third-party management solutions are significant in providing value to the organization. When you look for solutions to help us manage risk and compliance in a third-party context, there's 3 areas that they deliver value to the organization. One is the efficiency angle. And that is, how can I achieve more with less resources? As I face something like conflict mineral compliance and have to send out surveys and bring those back and build reports across 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 or more different suppliers, how can I do that efficiently with less staff time and less dollar impact? So efficiency in both human and financial capital resources. The other angle is effectiveness. At the end of the day, technology and third-party GRC solutions can help us be more effective in our environment, to gather information more quickly, analyze, alert when there's issues to respond to, have documented evidence trails that are defensible in court and defensible with regulators, that have full audit trails of who did what, how, why, how, and when. They're more effective. And in that context, the third angle is agility. The business is constantly changing, the risk and regulatory environment is constantly changing, and technology helps us to be agile, to be aware of that change, to communicate the change, and to be able to understand the current situation, what I call 360-degree contextual awareness of the environment, so I can be agile. So third-party management solutions provide good management reporting, like the annual conflict mineral reports that publicly traded companies have to submit to the SEC in context of conflict mineral compliance, audit trails that are defensible to the regulators of who did what, why, how, and when. There's accountability through workflow and tasks. If I'm trying to manage assessments and surveys and communication of like supply chain code of conduct and things, and documents, spreadsheets, and emails, well, things are going to slip through the cracks if I'm going to have to deal with hundreds or thousands of different suppliers doing that. We need good accountability and workflow and tasks, and when things aren't responded to, there's escalation. It helps us collaborate internally with different third-party and supply chain stakeholders within the business, across those supplier relationships, and even broader networks that really provide a foundation for entire industries. Helps us enforce the overall environment and what we're trying to achieve. So the critical elements of a third-party information and technology architecture for dealing with supply chain management and other third-party vendor relationships and so forth. One is supplier empowerment. The need to collaborate and provide visibility into our third-party relationships while balancing that third-party confidentiality. We need a strong user experience. Some of the solutions I monitor out there are very dated solutions, and they look like they're written 10 years ago or 15 years ago. And on top of that, they're overly complex, and sometimes we're communicating things to in an international context that might not quite understand things if they're not presented properly in the right context for them and in the right language for them. So we need good user experience. We need multi-use information where we can take in internal content that we gather, as well as content and assessments across our third-party relationships, And then even further, external content, whether it's from like third-party databases and watch lists and politically exposed person lists, geopolitical risk information, and so forth, so we can achieve that 360-degree contextual awareness. Where the delivery model is important. Can people access the platform? And is it readily accessible? The ability for the third-party solution to be configurable and adaptable to the organization's specific needs, and to manage the overall life cycle of third-party risk and compliance, just past the onboarding throughout the entire life cycle to the offboarding. So that third-party management plan that we're dealing with, that whole life cycle of those third-party supplier relationships, has 4 fundamental components: identify, monitor, assess, and reevaluate. I'll go into those shortly as we hit the next slides. We have to understand the risks involved in a third-party relationships, as well as the value that that third-party relationship is providing. And all this comes together with a third-party governance team that might span areas of procurement and legal and corporate compliance and ethics and other areas, so that we can build out our third-party management plan. The third-party management plan is what do we need to be able to do in context of third-party GRC in relationship to our goals. What are we trying to achieve? And one of those goals might be enforce our values and ethics across the supply chain with our supply chain code of conduct. Another goal might be to meet conflict mineral requirements and to be able to gather the assessments and do the reporting and provide those audit trails there. And then we need to also understand not only what the goals are, who are our audience, what types of third parties do we deal with? Is it all supply chain? And if it is supply chain, how does it go down to different tiers of the supply chain? How far do we go? But there's other types of third parties. It could be vendors. It could be outsourcers, service providers, contractors, consultants, temporary workers, agents, intermediaries, brokers. There's a range of different types of third parties. We need to define those and establish the goals, and then assign the resources. What resources do we need? Technical resources in the technology platform we're talking about right now, different types of policies or assessments. Maybe it's audit resources to go out and do the on-site inspections when things warrant that. How do we make our communication plan accessible? What languages are we going to support for the business to communicate things like policies and assessments within? How do we make it accessible from a technical perspective? Do we have some type of solution that's readily available out there on the internet? Do we poke holes through our firewall? How do we make it accessible to gather this information? How do we measure? What are the metrics, the key performance indicators and key risk indicators of third-party relationships? Then how do we align different parts of what we're trying to achieve, from the supply chain code of conduct to the different assessments we're conducting and communications and reporting? At the end of the day, the suppliers don't have, the capacity to answer assessments, every week of the year. How do we align and integrate things to make things efficient on the suppliers, but still cover what we need to cover with them? And then who are those internal stakeholders that we need to report to and communicate to when it comes to reporting third-party risk and compliance? And do we have executive support and sponsorship of this program as well? That's the third-party management plan that helps us understand our technology needs and being able to go from there into the technology environment. So a third-party technology platform is going to help us identify who our third parties are, who the contracts and contact information is for all the third parties, mapping of the internal stakeholders that have a vested interest in that third-party relationship, define triggers for alerts or changes that indicate that something needs to happen here, and measure the overall risk exposure level of control that we want to be able to monitor in those third-party relationships as well. The second part of a technology architecture for third parties is the ability to monitor, to go out and perform different ongoing monitoring against databases like politically exposed persons, sanctions, watch lists, geopolitical risks, reputation and brand risks, to be able to monitor the contract and key risk indicators and performance indicators across that. And to monitor and manage changing risks and requirements in those third-party relationships, which closely ties in the next section. Here, in the third area of technology for third-party management, supply chain management, is the assess piece, where we send out on a periodic basis, such as annual, or as need arises, as there might be some type of situation that warrants it, different types of risk and compliance self-assessments. This could be the conflict mineral questionnaire that we send out on an annual basis. It could be something on social accountability. It could be an integrated questionnaire that combines several different areas. But how do we send surveys and questions out to our third parties to understand where they're at and provide some level of accountability and audit trail there? And the fourth area of technology to be concerned with in third-party management is the ability to monitor and maintain those third-party relationships with re-evaluation, to re-evaluate them on a periodic basis to look at, is this third-party relationship performing as we expected? Are there unnecessary and unwanted risks in this relationship that we really don't need? Or, and on the flip side, is it creating a lot of value for the organization beyond what we expected, and we should expand here? So what are the contract provisions and controls? What's the use of the use of the third party internally, and how is it effective and efficient on the organization? Have we had specific issues and incidents, and how were those resolved? To help us reevaluate that third party relationship, which might mean a renewal of a contract or might mean offboarding of the relationship. Throughout all this, another important element of a technology platform is the area for independent assessment. We have our right to audit clauses in our third-party contracts, and in that, we need to be able to exercise those right to audit clauses and get independent assurance, whether if it's through outside firms that we're using as monitors to go out and do on-site inspections, or if it's our own audit resources, to go out and validate the findings. Maybe it's random sampling of our third-party relationships. One Fortune brand that I worked with, they categorized every supplier on like a stoplight diagram, red, yellow, green. High-risk vendors or suppliers were audited every year, while medium-risk suppliers were audited every 2 years, and low-risk suppliers every 3 years. Just one example. But the technology platform should be able to provide a place for us to integrate the audit information and findings as we seek assurance on those third-party relationships. The keys to success for managing a third-party management program with a good information technology architecture is to really understand who are my third parties and who owns those relationships, and what are we trying to communicate, what are those risks in the relationships, and then evaluating the overall risk and value and keeping those in context with each other, and being able to provide accountability through proper notifications and actions and escalation procedures when things are slipped and don't follow through. Some common mistakes that I see in managing third-party supplier risk is trying to manage this manually in documents, spreadsheets, and emails. Things slip through the cracks. Not standardizing our policies and procedures like the supply chain code of conduct and other related policies. And failing to consider other internal parties. Maybe I'm just focusing on my little part of the world and don't realize that there's other parts of the organization that are working with suppliers as well, and they have needs and they're communicating things. How can I work with them? Those are the keys to success and the mistakes.
Thanks for the abundance of information, Michael. We've come to our last question here, and it's in regard to the GRC 2020 Innovator Award. And our last question is, what stood out in context of source intelligence that stood out to you in giving us the award?
It's all about innovation. And innovation is who's breaking new ground and doing new things out there in the world, and in this case, in the context of third-party supplier risk and compliance management. And I had a lot of entries, particularly in this category. And a lot of them just sounded, oh, me too. The things that I've been seeing for a couple of years now. Source intelligence really stood out, and that's why I recognize them as an innovator in this area. And basically, the source intelligence network is there to help really provide a compelling offering for managing risk and compliance across a complex and distributed third-party, particularly supply chain relationships. And in that context, I really noted the ease of use and user experience. The source intelligence platform provides a very intuitive user experience that makes organizations, as well as their suppliers, more efficient, effective, and agile in managing and monitoring these relationships. And it provides a network of organizations so you can learn from the experience of others, which is quite interesting and collaborative. At the end of the day, providing what's been characterized as very much a LinkedIn for supply chains and business relationship. Quite fascinating. And so that's the overall context of why I recognize source intelligence above the many other nominations for the 2015 GRC Innovation Award for Best User Experience in Third-Party Management. Some of the differentiators that I saw with the source intelligence nomination that I didn't see in the other ones was the ability for supplier empowerment. And the fact that suppliers themselves aren't just having to respond to things, but they actually feel a part of the overall network, and things are done in a way that makes it efficient for them. and so they're not just always being beaten up on all the time. And then the second thing is supplier data integrity through continuous validation and monitoring. That it just wasn't a point in time, but it's something that's ongoing being monitored, and you can learn from the experiences from other people on the network. This altogether provides what I call 360-degree contextual intelligence to see the big picture of supply chain risk and compliance. That contextual intelligence is brought forth in supplier analytics and reporting that is very graphical and easy to use and understand. And in that analytics, it provides a depth of supplier network and relationships, so we can drill down not just into our first tier, but down into the subsequent tiers of our supply chain and vendor relationships to get the big picture and exposure upon the organization. The particular benefits that I saw in the source intelligence nomination is that it helps us increase confidence in risk and compliance, that when the executives have to sign their name on the dotted line for compliance and risk management oversight for third-party relationships, they got full visibility and reporting that they can be more confident when they have to sign off on risk and compliance, as well as the owners of those third-party relationships. Global reach and being able to span around the world and get multiple entities around the world involved in a common network for third-party management. And in that context, risk and regulatory agility, being able to understand, supplier disruptions, supplier regulatory issues, how they not only impact one organization, but a variety of organizations involved in the network, and the cascading effect of regulatory issues and developments as well. This brought together the ability to collaborate, to provide a platform to collaborate internally with other stakeholders for third-party and supplier management within my own business, the ability to collaborate with my suppliers and third-party relationships, but also the ability to collaborate across the network with other organizations in my industry and perhaps others that are facing similar issues and working with similar suppliers, if not the same suppliers as I am. All this brings together actionable intelligence, that 360-degree contextual awareness, so I can see the big picture of things and take action on it and mitigate the exposure to my business. And at the end of the day, a lot of us are trying to respond to regulatory developments, and it's about defensible compliance, things that I don't get in documents, spreadsheets, and emails, with full audit trails of who answered what question when, what was the current state of the assessment, and without the risk of things being modified to get the organization or somebody else out of trouble, and in that case, you're really compromising our whole compliance process. We have defensible compliance with strong audit trails. So the overall value trajectory, the GRC 2020 value trajectory of source intelligence, is that utilizing the source intelligence platform, when I evaluated them for the GRC Innovation Award, it helps organizations achieve brand loyalty and reputation, to achieve operational efficiencies, particularly across the third-party risk and compliance processes within the organization, as well as on the supplier responding side. Increase productivity through stronger relationships by identifying those relationships that are working, and those that create unnecessary risk and exposure we can identify as well, and perhaps minimize their use or avoid their use. Being able to have a solution that covers the geographic and supplier reach of my particular business that might operate around the world with thousands of relationships. And in that case, minimizes the risk in my supply chain and providing that defensible compliance. And I've said that several times, but I think that's critical, because doing this in documents, spreadsheets, and emails is a recipe for disaster. Things slip through the cracks, but again, they don't have audit trails, and the regulators are getting wise to this. And if you're sending out assessments in a spreadsheet and bringing them back, and all of a sudden there's a hot issue or something that comes up, there's too much temptation upon the organization to manipulate data to present to the regulators, and that can be too easily done in spreadsheets and documents. We need defensible compliance so that when the assessment's done, we know what the state of the assessment was at that point in time. And if anything was changed, there's a full audit record and trail of what was changed, who changed it, why it was changed, when it was changed, and so forth. Defensible compliance is a significant value to organizations. So when I look at different solutions in the GRC market, I break them into fragmented, managed, and agile. Or we can say basic, common, and advanced. Fragmented solutions and approaches are really manual processes that are very cumbersome, a lot of times dealing with documents, spreadsheets, and emails, like I mentioned. While managed solutions are, good solutions that provide good workflow and task and get the job done, but they don't necessarily provide all the intelligence we need. The agile solutions are the ones that can be used cross departments, so across areas of supply chain management dealing with quality and health and safety and procurement and legal and compliance, that they can work together and collaborate and share information and provide 360-degree contextual awareness of risk and compliance in the context of the organization. And in the GRC innovation context, that's where I've mapped source intelligence into the agile category.
Thank you, Devin, for the introduction, and thank you, Michael, for your informative presentation. It's really an honor to receive such a prestigious award from GRC 2020. Now that we've seen what encompasses the Innovative Award in third-party and supply chain risk management, let me now dive into what makes Source Intelligence a leader in this space and a #1 provider for supply chain transparency. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to log into the Source Intelligence cloud-based platform. First, I'm going to log in as a Source Intelligence client managing multiple supply chain facing campaigns. As I log in and come to the home page, let me point out a few things that are going to be common about all the supply chain facing initiatives and the type of communication that's going back and forth. One of the things I heard very clearly in Michael's presentation is the need for auditable data. So everything I show you, I'll show you how we track the communication logs, whether that be through phone, email, or through the platform itself. Maintain all of that for auditors in case any of these campaigns do need to be audited in the future. And also just point out some of the menus here. We're looking at our home screen as we come in. We have a profile page we can go to where we control the look and feel that our suppliers see as far as our logo, our identifying information as a company. When I say us, I mean the sample client. Intelligence about the supply chain facing campaigns and the data that we're gathering, and information about our network of suppliers, the interactions that going on with them, and the data that we store for each particular supplier. So again, we talk about how this platform manages traffic both upstream and downstream in a supply chain. So from the downstream perspective, I can see that I, as and by the way, I'm logged in as a fictitious client here called Global Supply Company, but I can see that from one of my downstream customers, a steel company, I am being requested to complete a conflict minerals reporting template, or a CMRT. Of course, I would have already liked the opportunity to have to reach out to my supply chain to gather that kind of information so I could respond to this request. And that's what we have here. So here we have multiple information requests, and these are my supply chain facing requests. So I'm reaching out to my supply chain for say acknowledgement of my anti-corruption policies, or maintaining records and e-certification of that information. Conflict minerals compliance, restricted substance on things like REACH, ROSE, California Prop 65, and others. California Supply Chain and Transparencies Act, the SB 657. Or maybe I'm just reaching out and asking my suppliers to sign my annual anti-corruption code of conduct policy statement. So I have these different information requests out. I can respond to my downstream customer if I log into this request. Then, as you'll see, I'm expected to either upload or create a conflict minerals reporting template to respond to this customer. Let me hop back, and I'll point out that in addition to this most recent request for information, I also have one other open request. So besides this, a steel company, there's another open request, in this case also for conflict minerals compliance. And if we go down a little further, we'll see a network timeline of all major events that are unfolding, again, whether it be upstream with my supply chain or downstream with my customers. So we're maintaining at a high level all this kind of information. Let's poke into one of these campaigns and see some additional information that we're storing. One of the things I'll point out that all campaigns have from a high level is the idea of participation. In this case, we're saying, well, we're reaching out to 129 suppliers, and a certain number have responded by completing the information request. Others may have registered but not completed, and maybe some haven't registered yet. So let's poke into this, and we can take a look and see what's happening in that regard. We're going to see a timeline of our campaign unfolding, and we tend to look at that in terms of two ways. One is daily activity in terms of our suppliers responding by registering into the platform and viewing these information requests. And maybe as these campaigns unfold in real time, you'll see spikes like this as we have our supplier engagement team reach out with a phone call campaign or an email reminder campaign. And over the life of the campaign, you'll see these spikes and you'll see the increases in registration. The second timeline will show you the actual completion of information requests, in this case, a conflict minerals CMRT. One thing I'll point out too, that anywhere in the platform where you see lists like this, in this case our suppliers and the number of registered users and when they responded, etc., all of which again becomes part of the audit trail. But all of this data is exportable. We do understand that this system for managing this kind of supplier engagement and downstream customer traffic is not necessarily going to be the central repository for data in an organization. So this can all be exported and imported into your ERP systems, your PLM systems, or modeled in any other way that you want. Okay. In addition to this type of information, we can then go look at our network and see some additional information. For example, we can see, supplier by supplier, what type of information requests they've already completed, and of course we can poke into them and review those data points. We can also search and filter by different criteria through our open campaigns, or for different types of say groups of suppliers, whether they be by our region or by our spend, or which customers their products roll up into, that kind of thing. But again, when we talk about communication and traffic and maintaining auditable data, one of the things we're really going to want to be able to do is go into any one of our suppliers and take a look at the communication logs and see, phone calls and email activity. What were they about? How were they resolved? Who were the people that were involved? And whether those be, incoming communications or outgoing. All of that is something that we want to be able to track and make part of the audit trail. Okay. Then as we're gathering information and we're maintaining the audit trail of the actual way by which we're receiving that information, again, going back to Michael's presentation, one of the things we know we're going to have to prove to auditors is that all of these information data points that we received were provided by a client. We're not, changed midstream by, an operator of some kind. But in addition to that type of information, we also have intelligence. And so we have dashboards built out for conflict minerals, restricted substances, the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act. Each of these types of supply chain facing campaigns have different requirements for how this information is rolled up, viewed, analyzed. But again, all of it ties back to the audit trail of how we obtain the information. So things you might see, for example, in conflict minerals might be something like a sourcing map, where you will see all of the mines that provide the raw materials that are then used by your smelters and refiners. So we can see, for example, in this world map of our supply chain, if I click on Japan, I can see that these are all the mines that are providing gold to my gold smelters, and so on. We can look at our smelters themselves, and we can see things like which smelters are currently active in a certification process with a certifying body like the CFSI or the Tungsten Industry Conflict Minerals Council. So again, we're looking at data that has come in from suppliers, has been vetted, has been tracked as far as how we obtain that information, and goes all the way back to smelters and mines with their countries of origin and risk level. So it's very robust, very rich data that's being maintained in a network of supplier responses. Similar things, if we look at restricted substances, we can see how many of our products have been flagged as impacting or being impacted by a particular regulation, and whether or not they are compliant with that regulation based on an exemption that may or may not be expiring soon. So again, a lot of important data there. We can go down and look, for example, this is telling us 9 of our products are impacted, and we can see which of those products are impacted by which regulation. Again, all of this ties back to the audit trail for this type of data. Now let's take a look at this from the supplier experience. So far we've been logged in as a source intelligence client responding to downstream customers and looking at supplier information. But what if we want to log in as a supplier? And we'll see something very similar. We'll see our timeline of network activity, our open requests from our upstream suppliers as we're gathering, say in this case, restricted substance data that we're going to now roll up and provide to our downstream customers. I have that same ability to maintain my profile as to control how my customers and my suppliers see my organization. And I also have my network of interactions with my suppliers and can poke into them and view my audit trail, etc. And another thing I'll point out as we wrap up here is that Michael really keyed in on the need for this to take place in the native languages of the people who are providing this information. So in this case, a supplier who's interacting with the source intelligence platform has the opportunity to come in, or I should say immediately as they enter the platform, to select their language and operate in that language. So for example, if we just change to Chinese, and you'll see that the platform is then translated into Mandarin. So very important that suppliers be able to interact in their native language, and in fact not just interact with the platform that way, but also receive technical support through phone, email, chat in their native language, which Source Intelligence also provides. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Again, I'd like to thank you, Michael, for highlighting the basis for the GRC 2020 award. And thanks again to you, Devin, for putting this together, and for our audience for taking a look at the platform and seeing why Source Intelligence is a leader in this space. Devin, back to you.
Great presentations, everyone. Thank you for both sharing with the GRC 2020 Innovation Awards and the exclusive look at why Source Intelligence is honored to receive this award. Again, as a reminder, if you joined us a little late, this webinar recording and all slides will be available online for review at sourceintelligence.com/webinar library. Questions asked through the GoToWebinar control panel will receive responses shortly after this webinar today. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to email us at education@sourceintelligence.com. Also, if you're interested in more information, please check out our upcoming white paper library. This is Devin Simonson with Source Intelligence. Thank you all for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.